I have finally read every single Stephen King novel that he's written up through this year, and it has been quite the task. For anyone who doesn't know, I host a Stephen King podcast called Chat Cemetery, where I have been going through everything chronologically and just covering not only the novels, but the short story collections as well as the adaptations. I will admit, I did not watch all of the Children of the Corn movies, but I don't think anyone needs to do that. Today, though, I want to talk about the experience of reading through all of King's novels and, frankly, what I learned while I was doing so. And for me, the only novel I didn't read in this last 3 year period since I started the podcast was The Shining. I admittedly made the mistake of not rereading that for the early episodes of the podcast because I was like, I read it a year or two ago. It'll be fine. It was probably more than a year or two before I had started the podcast. And I just thought I had read it more recently than I had. So that's kind of my one regret with reading all of his novels, that I did not reread The Shining for my podcast. But one of the big things I learned is honestly just that, you know, Stephen King is an amazing author, but he's not perfect. And, maybe some people will be a little upset with me for saying that, but I really do think that I have learned a lot, not only about sort of how I personally read books, but also how people write books. King had ups and downs throughout his career, whether it was because he, was hit by a van on the side of the road, or he had a massive cocaine addiction, which he has admitted to. So, you see him sort of go through the motions with a lot of his early novels, especially. You have you know, Cujo, Christine, Pet Cemetery, some of these novels that maybe are a little more wild as far as, the pacing and what happens in them goes, as some of his later novels once he gets sober. And, for me, some of the books I don't like actually came after he got sober. And I'm not saying it's because he got sober, but let's just say the Tommyknockers is by far not my favorite book of Stephen King's. It might be my absolute least favorite, actually, and I didn't have too many that I dislike, thankfully. I think out of the 70-ish books he's written, I only didn't enjoy 5 of them. So that's a pretty good hit rate if you ask me. And there were a couple where it was take it or leave it. I didn't dislike them. I didn't love them either. They kind of fell right in the middle for me, and frankly, that's a lot of things too. A lot of things are 3 out of 5, and I really do think that he is someone who has obviously dedicated his life to this. He's been writing for decades, and even though I think he is flawed as a writer, he has shown that he has changed with the times, albeit not perfectly, but I still think there's a lot that people can learn from reading Stephen King works, especially if they want to be writers themselves. I don't particularly want to write fiction novels or anything like that, but even just his short story collections, you can see how far he's come from his really, really early works, like a lot of the stuff in the Bachman books collection, for instance, which I have a copy that still has Rage in it, which is since out of publication. And it's definitely interesting to be able to see that comparison from his early works through today, basically. And I've really enjoyed a lot of the recent stuff, which I know has been hit or miss for a lot of people. But I really loved Later, which is one of his hard case crime novels. And something else that I learned is that just because he does those hard case crime novels, that does not mean he's not going to go back and tie it to his own Stephen King universe, because I had read Colorado Kid and Joyland, and they didn't really tie into anything. But then I went and read Later, which is the most recent one, and oh boy, does it tie in. I don't want to spoil anything for anyone, but it definitely has ties to his universe. And that's another thing. I'm amazed that he's been able to keep all of this straight over the years, because you have early novels like The Stand tying into the Dark Tower novels. You have later novels like Insomnia and Rose Madder, even tying into the Dark Tower, and so many of his other novels too, quite frankly. And you really get to see how he has built up this whole universe from not necessarily just one simple idea, it's far from simple, but just this sort of bigger concept that he has been working on for decades and decades. And it's really impressive to see how that all ties together in various ways throughout all of his novels. And again, not all of them tie into this sort of macroverse that he's built, but I do think there's a lot to take away from by reading all of his novels, which, as you can tell, I did it in a pretty small time frame. 3 years is not a lot of time to consume this much King by any means, and I'm not even talking about all of the stuff I've watched as well. Just the reading alone was a massive undertaking. And now that I'm caught up, I kind of have, hindsight of maybe I should have done this at a little slower pace. And, it would have allowed me to retain a lot more information. But I still did learn that I really love the interconnectivity of a lot of his stories. And even if there were some that were connected and weren't my favorites, I think King has written about a wide variety of topics over the years that don't just tie into either the horror or fantasy genre, which obviously, Dark Tower is this big, massive, epic fantasy, and you have all of these different things that are horror that tie into it. And you also have, his more sci fi stuff, like I said, Tommy Knockers. And, I do have to admit, I learned that aside from, it and the Deadlights and that whole sort of foreign entity alien story. I don't really love King's alien stories, was not a fan of Tommyknockers or Dreamcatcher. And there are some alien appearances in like Under the Dome, which didn't bother me as much, but the ones that definitely leaned way more into what I would call a traditional sort of alien story, especially with Tommyknockers, just did not work for me. And, Sleeping Beauties was another one I didn't particularly love, just because it felt like it was trying to do something that Under the Dome kind of already did, and it just didn't make me care about the characters quite as much as I was hoping for. And speaking of characters, King's character work is by far my favorite thing about his writing. And I have loved so many of the characters that he has introduced. You have the kids in The Body, you have the Losers Club in It. And yes, I do happen to like a lot of the children characters or preteen characters, if you will, more than some of the adult characters that he has introduced. But I think he does a very good job of sort of capturing this coming of age during a specific time period. A lot of these stories are taking place in, the 50s, for instance, with It. And you have this sort of different era where kids had more freedom to just sort of roam around and get into trouble, honestly. It seems pretty hard to get into trouble these days when most of us are on the internet. And even as a 90s kid, I was on the computer a lot, playing whatever games I had. I can't even remember the names of most of them, but it really feels like it was just a completely different world back then. And quite frankly, it probably really was. And so just capturing that time period and the way he captures small towns and the people who live in them, it's just so well done that you feel like you're a part of it. And that was one of the reasons that honestly I kept going through this. When I started it, I did intend to see it all the way through, but with something as massive as King's bibliography, I personally would not blame anyone if they started and did not make it through everything. I really had to, just put my head down and spend a lot of time doing this stuff for my podcast. And I learned that not only do I really enjoy King's work, but I really love a lot of different types of horror novels. And I haven't had a chance to get through nearly as many as I would like because he has so many books that I've been spending my time reading. But I really do think that it has made me love the horror genre even more, which I am very, very thankful for because there's so much to explore, not only in books, but in movies and TV as well. I've definitely been expanding my horror horizons, if you will, thanks to this wild Stephen King journey that I, for some reason, decided to go on. I'm still not really sure what made me really decide to just go all in on this, but I am glad that I did. And if you are a huge Stephen King fan, I hope you will consider checking out my podcast, which again is Chat Cemetery. And, I have rated everything from half a star to 5 stars. So there's a huge scope once you throw in the books and the adaptations and everything. And, as far as sort of what's next for me in this King journey that I'm on, I'm going to track down some of the single episode TV show adaptations. So, like the grandma episode of The Twilight Zone, The Word Processor of the Gods TV episode that is floating around out there, and try to track down some of the dollar babies and just really kind of keep going for my Patreon supporters. And there I will also be covering the Dark Tower and the Stand comics and any other comics that have come out. So Sleeping Beauties and a few others have comic book adaptations as well. And, I have learned that I am really enjoying the Stephen King comic books. So that's another plus for this whole experience. And, if you are a Stephen King fan and you've made it all the way to the end of this video, let me know what some of your favorites are in the comments, or even some of your least favorites. And I will definitely have some more Stephen King content on the way. There are plenty of top lists and worst of lists that I can do now that I have sort of experienced almost everything there is to experience. Like I said, I just have those few TV show episodes and some of the comics left. But otherwise, this has been an amazing, amazing process for me. I, however, am glad that it's over because I am going to get so much free time back, but it'll allow me to put out more Stephen King content in other ways for this channel and the podcast. So if you like this video, hit the like button, share it, hit the subscribe button, and get notified when I have new videos out. And that is all I have for you today. So thank you so much for watching. You can follow me on socials at the link in the show description, and I will see you next time.